Imagine waking up not to the sound of an alarm clock, but to the clatter of wooden carts, the bleating of goats, and the burning Mediterranean sun streaming through a clay window. The air is thick with the smell of smoke and sweat. There's no coffee waiting, no clean water running from a tap. You step outside, barefoot on the rough stone street, and realize that in ancient Greece, you are already behind on your day, because survival here isn't easy. And if you think you could handle it, well, you probably wouldn't last a day. Welcome to History for Sleep. This is where we drift through the past softly, slowly into stories that feel almost like dreams. But tonight's dream is no gentle one. It's a journey into the daily life of ancient Greece, a world of philosophy and beauty. Yes, but also hunger, hardship, and endless labor. Before you close your eyes and wander the marble streets of Athens, remember that beneath the marble was dirt, and behind every statue stood someone exhausted, sunburned, and hungry. This wasn't a place for the weak. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe to History for Sleep and let us know in the comments what kind of history you'd like to fall asleep to next. Do you listen at night, drifting off to ancient worlds? Or during the day, when you need to slow your mind and escape the rush of modern life? Your thoughts and dreams shape where we go next. So, settle in. Let your mind sink back 2,500 years. The air grows warmer, the sound of sandals on stone echoes softly, and the scent of olive oil and smoke fills the air. We're going back to the time of gods and philosophers, of warriors and slaves, of beauty and struggle. Close your eyes if you wish, and imagine living a single day in ancient Greece. You may love its myths, its temples, and its art, but tonight you'll learn why life there was far from divine. And by the end, you might be grateful for the soft pillow beneath your head, the water by your bedside, and the gentle hum of electricity that keeps your world alive. Let's begin. When people think of ancient Greece, their minds fill with marble temples gleaming under blue skies, white-robed philosophers debating wisdom, and the distant sound of lyres playing gentle melodies. The art, the myths, the stories of gods and heroes all create an image of paradise, a world where beauty, intellect, and virtue thrived side by side. But the truth, as with most of history, was far more difficult. Ancient Greece was not a land of ease, it was a land of survival. The glory we imagine today was built upon the sweat and suffering of countless ordinary people. Life in Greece was rugged and demanding. The mountains that made the land beautiful also made it hard to live in. Farmland was scarce, the soil often dry and rocky, and the summers were long, hot, and punishing. Most people were not sculptors or philosophers. They were farmers, shepherds, fishermen, and slaves. They rose with the first light of dawn, toiling under the sun until the heat became unbearable, and even then, rest was rare. Every meal, every drop of oil, every thread of clothing came at a price of labor that never seemed to end. The Greece of marble perfection existed mostly in the imagination of its poets. Most homes were made of sun-baked clay, small and dark, often with only 1 or 2 rooms. Streets were narrow and dusty, filled with smoke from cooking fires. The air carried the smell of animals, of sweat, and of the sea. Inside the cities, even the grand ones like Athens, life was cramped and noisy. The people who built the temples and statues often lived in homes so small they could barely stretch out to sleep. Yet those same people filled the world with art, poetry, and thought that would outlive empires. To live in ancient Greece meant accepting that life was uncertain. Droughts could ruin harvests. Disease could sweep through at any time. And war was never far away. Yet out of that constant struggle came the fierce pride of being Greek. They believed their hardships forged strength and virtue. To suffer was to learn, to work was to honor the gods, and to endure was to live well. Comfort, to them, was a sign of weakness. Still, the myth of paradise lingers. We look at their ruins and imagine a civilization of peace and intellect. We forget the slaves who quarried the stone, the women who worked from dawn to dusk, and the children who never grew old enough to dream. It's easy to see the past through the lens of beauty. Harder to hear the voices that whispered through the dust, asking for one more day of good weather, one more loaf of bread, one more night of safety. If you were to wake up in that world, you might be stunned by the simplicity of everything. No roads like ours, no lights, no comforts, just earth, stone, and sky. The people who lived there didn't think of themselves as ancient. They were simply alive, in their moment, doing what they could to survive. And perhaps that is the truest thing about ancient Greece. Beneath the stories of gods and heroes was the heartbeat of ordinary life, steady, quiet, and unending. You would see that paradise was not marble or myth. It was the chance to wake up one more morning and see the sun rise over the Aegean Sea. Wouldn't last a day in that world, because you'd expect comfort, and comfort was nowhere to be found. But those who did live there, they found beauty in the struggle. They found meaning in work, faith in hardship, and hope in the smallest things. And maybe that's why their world, harsh as it was, still echoes in our dreams today. The first thing you would feel in ancient Greece is the heat. It would not be the gentle warmth of a summer afternoon, but a heavy, relentless heat that clings to your skin and fills the air like a living thing. The Mediterranean sun rose early and ruled the day without mercy. There were no cool breezes from air conditioners, no shaded sidewalks, no clean glass of iced water to ease the thirst. The sun was the master of all, and everyone lived according to its will. Imagine walking across a stone courtyard barefoot, the ground already warm before noon. Farmers worked in fields that shimmered under the sun's glare, their skin darkened and cracked from years of exposure. The soil was hard, and the tools were simple. Wooden plows, sometimes drawn by donkeys or oxen, carved through rocky earth that yielded little. To get enough grain for bread was an achievement in itself. Even in the most fertile regions, the struggle was constant. One bad season could mean hunger for an entire family, or worse, for a whole village. The cities offered little relief. In Athens, the narrow streets trapped heat, and the air became heavy with the scent of sweat, olive oil, and smoke from cooking fires. Shade was precious and fleeting. People took refuge under awnings, in the corners of courtyards, or beneath the sparse leaves of olive trees. The wealthy might retreat to homes with thicker walls that kept the air slightly cooler. But for most, the day was a test of endurance. And the sun, as much as it burned, also dictated life's rhythm. Work began early and ended when the light faded. Rest was not luxury, it was necessity. Water was life. But even water had its limits. Wells were shallow, streams unpredictable. In summer, rivers shrank, and people walked miles to fill clay jugs with what they could find. The water was rarely clean by our standards, but it sustained them. Olive oil, that golden liquid so celebrated in Greek life, was used for everything: cooking, fuel, even cleaning the skin. To wash, people rubbed oil onto their bodies and scraped it away with curved bronze tools. The scent of oil and sweat lingered on everyone, mingling with dust and salt from the sea. And yet, despite the hardship, life carried on with a rhythm that matched the land itself. The Greeks understood their world deeply. They knew when to plant, when to harvest, and when to pray for rain. They built their homes to face the breeze and planned their days by the movement of the sun. Hardship, for them, was not tragedy, it was life. It forged patience, strength, and endurance. They did not curse the heat. They adapted to it. But for someone from the modern world, this would be unbearable. The constant thirst, the dry air, the absence of comfort, it would drain you. Your skin would burn, your feet would blister, and your energy would fade before the day was half over. Sleep, when it came, would be light and restless, the air thick and still. You would wake in the night, sweating, surrounded by the chorus of cicadas and the distant barking of dogs. And as dawn approached, you would hear the first sounds of life beginning again, knowing the heat would soon return. To live in ancient Greece was to live in harmony with discomfort. Every drop of sweat, every cracked hand, every moment of exhaustion was part of what it meant to be alive. They had no choice but to endure, and in that endurance they found a strange kind of peace. The land was hard, but it was also home. The sun, unforgiving as it was, gave light to their world and shaped their days. And maybe that is why, despite all the hardship, the people of ancient Greece left behind a civilization that still burns brightly in memory. They lived under the same sun we do, but they learned to face it without shade. If you were to sit down for a meal in ancient Greece, the experience would surprise you in more ways than one. Gone are the feasts of rich meats, creamy sauces, and sweet desserts that modern imagination often attaches to ancient banquets. The truth is, most people in Greece ate humbly, their diet shaped by the harshness of the land and the limits of what could grow in rocky soil. What they ate was simple, repetitive, and for the modern palate, often unsatisfying. Yet for them, it was the rhythm of survival. Bread was the heart of every meal. Coarse, dark, and dense, it was made from barley far more often than wheat. Barley was easier to grow in the dry soil, though it made for a heavier, rougher bread. The rich might have access to softer wheat loaves, but for the majority, each bite was a reminder of how hard the land was to work. Bread was eaten with olives, cheese, and whatever vegetables could be found. Olive oil, thick and fragrant, was a staple used to moisten bread, to cook vegetables, and even to clean the skin. It was precious, and to spill it carelessly was almost an act of sin. Breakfast, if it could be called that, was often a simple mix of bread soaked in wine. The wine was watered down, not the sweet indulgence we imagine, but thin and sharp, meant to make poor water drinkable. Midday meals might be no more than figs, nuts, or a handful of beans. Only the wealthy or those near the coast ate fish regularly, and meat was a rarity, often reserved for festivals or sacrifices to the gods. When meat appeared on the table, it was roasted simply over fire goat, lamb, or pork, and eaten quickly, shared among many. For most people, meat was a memory more than a meal. Vegetables like onions, garlic, and lentils were the true fuel of the Greek diet. They were cheap, filling, and grew where little else could. Stews made of lentils and barley were common, flavored with herbs like thyme or oregano. The air in a Greek home at dinner time would carry the earthy scent of boiling grain, smoke from the hearth, and the faint sweetness of figs drying on a string by the door. To us, it might seem meager, but to them, it was the taste of home. There were treats, of course. Honey was their only real sweetener, thick and golden, poured over bread or cheese in rare moments of indulgence. Wine was a part of daily life, but not in the way modern people use it for pleasure. It was nourishment, a safer drink than water, and a gift from Dionysus, the god of joy and madness. Drinking too much was seen as shameful, a loss of control that insulted both the gods and reason itself. Moderation was a virtue, and in a land of scarcity, excess was rarely possible. If you found yourself in ancient Greece, you might hunger for variety. You would miss the sugar, the spices, and the luxury of eating simply for taste. Their meals were built to survive, not to entertain. You would sit on a low stool, eat with your hands, and share from a common bowl. Plates were few, and utensils almost non-existent. The food would be warm but plain, and you might find yourself longing for something sweet or rich, something more familiar. But to the Greeks, simplicity was part of balance. A meal filled the body, but was never meant to distract from thought or work. The philosophers often spoke about food as a test of virtue. To eat little, to be content with enough, was a sign of wisdom. Excess, they believed, clouded the mind and weakened the soul. Perhaps that's why their civilization, though born in hardship, produced ideas that shaped the world. They knew hunger intimately, not just for food, but for meaning, for beauty, for truth. And in that hunger, they found creation. If you tried to live their way, you might not last a day. The bread would feel heavy, the portions too small, the flavors too plain. But for the Greeks, this was life itself sustained, not by abundance, but by endurance. To taste their world was to understand that survival, not comfort, was the truest feast of all. If you were to wake up in ancient Greece and look for a warm shower or a bar of soap, you'd be sorely disappointed. Hygiene, as we know it today, did not exist in that world. There were no scented shampoos, no toothbrushes, and certainly no daily baths with running water. Cleanliness was a constant challenge, and yet the Greeks had their own ways, unique, practical, and deeply tied to their culture and beliefs. But make no mistake, living through it would be a shock to your modern senses. Water was precious and difficult to come by. Most homes had no plumbing, and baths were far from a daily routine. Instead, people used olive oil for cleansing. After long hours of work or exercise, a person would pour a thin layer of oil over their skin, rubbing it in to loosen dirt and sweat. Then, with a curved bronze tool called a strigil, they scraped it all away. The process left the skin glistening, but not exactly fresh by our standards. The smell of oil, sweat, and the smoky air from nearby fires clung to everyone. It was the scent of the ancient world, earthy, human, and unavoidably real. Public bathhouses existed, especially in larger cities like Athens, but they were nothing like modern spas. These were simple, often crowded places with cold basins of water and little privacy. The wealthy might enjoy more elaborate bathing experiences, with attendants to help and oils imported from afar, but most people washed quickly and sparingly. A small jug of water poured over the head might count as a bath for the weak. Hot water was rare, reserved for the very rich or for use in the gymnasia, where men trained their bodies in the pursuit of strength and beauty. Teeth were another matter entirely. Toothbrushes, as we know them, didn't exist. People chewed on sticks, rubbed their teeth with rough cloth, or used crushed herbs and ashes to clean their mouths. It worked to a degree, but the results were far from the polished smiles of modern times. Tooth decay, gum disease, and bad breath were simply part of life. So too were lice, fleas, and other pests, constant companions in a world without soap or clean bedding. People combed their hair with wooden picks and used oil again, this time as a barrier against insects. It helped, but not completely. The Greeks did, however, believe that cleanliness was tied to purity, not just of the body, but of the soul. Before entering a temple, people washed their hands or sprinkled water over themselves as a sign of respect to the gods. Bathing was a ritual act as much as a physical one. They saw balance in all things, and too much concern for the body was considered vanity, while too little was seen as neglect. Moderation was everything. The gymnasium was the center of male social life and hygiene. Men exercised naked, their bodies coated in oil, then scraped clean afterward. It was both athletic and philosophical, a place to strengthen the body and the mind. For women, bathing was a quieter, more private affair. They might wash at home, using small basins and limited water, often with the help of a servant or family member. Privacy was rare, and comfort even rarer. If you were transported there, the first thing you would notice is the heaviness of the air, the mixture of oil, smoke, and sweat that lingered everywhere. You'd long for the crisp scent of soap, for a shower that could wash away the day. Your skin would feel slick, your hair would stiffen with dust and oil, and your clothes would absorb every bit of it. To the Greeks, this was simply normal. To you, it would feel unbearable after a few days. But even in that world of dirt and heat, there was a certain beauty in their simplicity. They respected the body as a vessel of the soul, and their rituals of oil and scraping, strange as they seem, carried meaning. They lived closer to the earth, accepting imperfection as part of existence. Perhaps, after a while, even you might come to understand that kind of peace. But it would take time and endurance to see past the discomfort. So if you were to step into an ancient Greek bathhouse, you might find wisdom there, hidden beneath the layers of oil and dust. Because in their world, being clean was not about perfection. It was about balance. And in that balance, they found something that many of us, even in our age of endless luxury, have long forgotten. When you think of ancient Greece, you might imagine elegant philosophers discussing virtue under the shade of olive trees, or artists carving statues that would last for millennia. But behind those rare moments of beauty and intellect lay the real engine of Greek life work. Relentless, physical, and often brutal work. For most people, the days were consumed not by contemplation, but by survival. Labor was the rhythm of life, and for many, it was inescapable. The land itself demanded effort. The Greek world was mostly mountainous, with narrow valleys and thin, rocky soil. Every harvest, every loaf of bread, came from backbreaking toil. Farmers rose before sunrise, guided by the faint glow of dawn, and walked to their fields carrying tools of wood and bronze. The plow cut through earth that resisted them with every stroke. Men, women, and even children worked side by side, planting, watering, and harvesting. There were no machines to ease the burden. Every furrow was dug by hand, every olive pressed with muscle and patience. Sweat was constant, and blisters became badges of endurance. For those in the cities, work took other forms. Potters shaped clay into jars and bowls, their hands calloused from long hours at the wheel. Blacksmiths stood before blazing furnaces, hammering iron until their arms ached. Builders and stonemasons labored on temples and homes, lifting stones so heavy they left their spines bent for life. In the crowded markets, merchants shouted over one another, selling fish, bread, oil, and cloth. The city was alive with noise and effort from dawn until dusk. There was no quiet time, no weekends, no respite from the demand to survive. Yet not all work was equal. Beneath every Greek household, every field, and every workshop was a workforce that truly kept the world turning slaves. Slavery was not an exception in ancient Greece. It was the foundation of its economy. Nearly every household that could afford it owned at least one slave, and larger estates might have dozens. Some were born into bondage, others captured in war or sold by traders. They worked the fields, tended fires, carried water, and even raised the children of their masters. Their labor allowed the citizens above them to think, to study, to fight, and to govern. Life as a slave could vary from harsh to unbearable. Those who served in homes might at least have shelter and food, though no freedom. Others worked in the mines, where darkness and danger never lifted. The silver mines of Laurion, south of Athens, were notorious narrow tunnels where men and boys toiled for hours in stifling heat, breathing dust that scarred their lungs. Many never saw the sun again after entering those tunnels. And yet their suffering helped fund the great monuments and fleets of Athens, the very symbols of its glory. Free citizens, even the poorest, viewed labor differently depending on its type. Manual labor, especially trade or craftsmanship, was often looked down upon by the elite. The ideal Greek citizen, particularly in Athens, was supposed to dedicate himself to thought, politics, and war, not to physical work. But the reality was far less noble. Most citizens worked with their hands because they had to. They farmed, built, and repaired. They sold goods in the agora, the public market, shouting their wares under the same sun that scorched the slaves beside them. The lines between survival and servitude blurred more often than anyone liked to admit. Women, too, bore the invisible weight of labor. Inside the home, their days were endless. They spun wool, wove cloth, baked bread, and fetched water from distant fountains. They managed the household stores, cared for children, and tended the hearth fire that could never be allowed to die out. Theirs was work that never ended, unseen and uncelebrated. Even the wealthiest women, who might command servants, lived within walls, their labor confined but unrelenting. For a modern person, this constant exertion would be unimaginable. The muscles would ache, the hands would blister, and exhaustion would come long before the day's end. There were no vacations, no hope of rest beyond sleep, and even sleep was short. The Greeks viewed work as both a duty and a necessity, something that defined human worth, but also chained it. Their gods rewarded effort, but they did not promise comfort. If you lived then, you would soon understand that work was not a part of life. It was life. To stop working was to risk starvation. And while we remember the philosophers and poets, it was the laborers and slaves who built their world, who turned thought into stone and sweat into civilization. You wouldn't last a day among them, not because of cruelty alone, but because every moment of rest had to be earned, every breath bought by effort. And yet, perhaps, that struggle gave their world its strength. They knew the value of each loaf of bread, each drop of oil, each moment of peace. In their hardship, they found meaning. Theirs was a civilization built not on ease, but on endurance, and that, in the end, may be why it still endures in memory today. To be born in ancient Greece was not a guarantee of life. Childhood in that world was a fragile and uncertain thing, with a line between survival and loss was heartbreakingly thin. For all the talk of heroism and intellect, the lives of most children were marked by hardship, discipline, and expectation. It was a time when innocence was brief, and growing up meant facing the full weight of the ancient world far too soon. From the moment of birth, survival was a question of fortune. Infant mortality was high, and families often lost more than one child before the first year. Newborns were washed in cold water to test their strength. In some city-states, especially in Sparta, the examination was brutal. Weak or deformed infants might be abandoned, left on hillsides or in wilderness, a practice born from the belief that only the strong should live. Even in more lenient cities like Athens, an unwanted child could be exposed left outside to die or be taken by strangers as a slave. It was a world where compassion had to yield to survival. For those who did live, life was simple but demanding. Toys were few: a carved piece of wood, a clay figure, or a small ball made from rags. Play existed, of course, but it was often woven into work. Boys helped their fathers in the fields, learning the weight of tools and the rhythm of the seasons. Girls stayed close to their mothers, helping to grind grain, weave cloth, and fetch water. Every child learned early that effort was not optional. There were no long years of carefree childhood as we imagine them now. Education, too, depended on who you were and where you lived. In Athens, boys of citizen families were taught to read, write, and recite poetry. They memorized the verses of Homer and learned the principles of music and arithmetic. But this was not education as comfort. It was rigorous, strict, and deeply moral. Teachers used switches and rods freely. Mistakes were met not with patience, but with correction through pain. Learning was discipline, not discovery. Girls, meanwhile, rarely attended school at all. Their education was in silence, obedience, and the skills of the household. In Sparta, childhood took on a darker form. At the age of 7, boys were taken from their families and placed into the agoge, a harsh military training system that stripped away tenderness and forged soldiers through deprivation. They slept on reeds, trained in cold and hunger, and were beaten not for failure, but for being caught failing. Discipline was absolute, and mercy was rare. They were taught to endure pain, to fight, and to die for their city without hesitation. For a Spartan child, affection was weakness. To live was to prepare for war. In other parts of Greece, childhood varied, but hardship never disappeared. Disease struck often. Food was sometimes scarce. The gods, it was believed, could bring both fortune and plague upon a household. So children grew up surrounded by prayer and superstition. Small charms were tied around their necks to ward off evil spirits. Offerings were made to protect them from the unseen. Yet despite these rituals, many families buried more children than they raised. Grief was common, though often unspoken. Death was part of life's order. Still, there were moments of light. Festivals allowed children to dance and sing in the streets, dressed in bright tunics, their laughter echoing off the stone walls. In Athens, young girls might serve as attendants in temples, offering flowers to the gods. Boys raced in the gymnasia, their shouts filling the air with energy. These moments, brief and bright, gave the illusion of joy in a world that demanded maturity too soon. Even then, childhood was less a stage of freedom and more a preparation for duty. If you were to live as a child in ancient Greece, you might find the days long and the expectations impossible. You would wake at dawn, work until exhaustion, and be reminded constantly of your place in the household. For a boy, it was a path toward manhood through discipline. For a girl, it was a life confined within walls, waiting for the day she would leave one home for another through marriage. There were no fairy tales, no gentle years. Childhood was a training ground for endurance. And yet, the Greeks loved their children deeply in their own way. They prayed to the gods for their safety, told them stories of heroes and monsters, and celebrated their milestones with joy. But their love was tempered by the knowledge that life was fragile. To love too softly was to invite heartbreak. So they raised their children to be strong, to endure, and to understand that life would never be easy. It was a harsh kind of love, born of necessity. If you were a child in ancient Greece, you would grow quickly or not at all. The world would demand your strength, your obedience, and your silence. And if you survived, you would carry with you the lessons of that hard beginning for the rest of your days. Because in ancient Greece, childhood was not a dream. It was the first test in a life of endless struggle. In the shimmering light of ancient Greece, where marble temples rose toward the heavens and philosophers spoke of reason and virtue, half the population lived largely unseen. Women, though vital to every aspect of Greek society, were confined to shadows restricted by laws, traditions, and expectations that denied them freedom. To be a woman in ancient Greece was to live within walls, both physical and invisible, built not from stone but from custom. And while their strength held families and communities together, their voices were rarely heard beyond the home. The role of a woman depended greatly on where she lived. In Athens, often praised as the cradle of democracy, women had almost no public life. They could not vote, own property independently, or speak in the assembly. Their world was the oikos, the household, a space they managed with quiet precision. Within those walls, they prepared food, spun wool, raised children, and supervised slaves if the family was wealthy enough to own any. They kept the hearth burning, a sacred duty that connected the home to the gods. But beyond the doorway, their freedom ended. Girls in Athens were married young, often in their early teens, to men far older than themselves. Marriage was not about love or companionship, but about alliances and the continuation of the family line. A girl's father chose her husband, and once she married, her life became tied to her husband's authority. Her duty was to bear sons, care for the home, and avoid drawing attention to herself. Respectable women were expected to be modest, quiet, and unseen. To be visible or outspoken in public was to risk scandal, and scandal could ruin not only her name, but her entire family's reputation. In contrast, women in Sparta lived very different lives, though their freedom came with its own harsh price. Spartan women were raised to be strong and physically fit, trained in exercise and discipline almost as rigorously as men. They could own land and manage estates, and their opinions carried weight within the household. But their independence existed for one reason: to produce healthy sons who would become soldiers. Their bodies were valued not for beauty or pleasure, but for strength and endurance. Spartan women spoke their minds more freely than most, but they lived under a constant expectation to give their lives and their children's lives to the state. Everywhere in Greece, a woman's reputation was her armor. Gossip and rumor were weapons that could wound as deeply as a sword. The line between respectability and disgrace was thin. Even within marriage, life could be isolating. Men often spent their days in public working, trading, or debating, while women stayed indoors, spinning and weaving, surrounded by servants or children. At night, men gathered in symposia, drinking and talking of politics, poetry, and philosophy. Women of status were not invited to such gatherings. The only women allowed there were hetairai courtesans who were educated, witty, and skilled in conversation. They lived beyond the rules that bound wives, but their freedom came at the cost of respectability. For poorer women, life was different, but no easier. Many worked in markets, selling goods or helping their husbands in labor. Some became wet nurses or midwives, others servants in wealthier homes. Their days were long and their work endless, but at least they walked the streets, felt the sun, and spoke freely with others. Poverty, while cruel, sometimes allowed a kind of independence that wealth could not. Motherhood was both a blessing and a burden. Childbirth was dangerous, and many women died bringing life into the world. There were no doctors as we know them, only midwives and prayers. Each birth carried risk, and each child was both a hope and a responsibility. To lose a child was a grief endured in silence, for mourning too loudly was thought unseemly. Yet the bond between mother and child was deep and fierce. Women, though bound by obedience, held the quiet strength that kept the household alive. Religion offered one of the few spaces where women could move freely. Festivals like the Thesmophoria allowed women to gather without men, honoring the goddess Demeter and celebrating fertility and renewal. In those moments, they found community and expression, laughing, singing, and performing rituals that had been passed down for generations. For a short time, they were not confined by their husbands' rules or society's gaze. In worship, they found both purpose and escape. If you were a woman in ancient Greece, your life would be defined by boundaries. You would wake before dawn, tend the fire, weave by lamplight, and watch the world from behind doorways and courtyards. You might hear the voices of men debating outside, knowing that your own words were not welcome there. You would carry the weight of silence, the ache of confinement, and yet you would find strength in the small acts that made life endure: baking bread, soothing a child, whispering prayers to the goddess who understood your struggle. For all their talk of freedom and democracy, the Greeks built a world that belonged mostly to men. But within that world, women sustained everything: the homes, the traditions, the very heartbeat of society. You might not have lasted long in such a life of restriction and quiet endurance, but those women did. They lived, they endured, and in their unseen strength, they shaped the world from behind the walls that kept them hidden. In a world without modern medicine, life in ancient Greece balanced constantly between health and sickness, life and death. For all their wisdom in philosophy, art, and politics, the Greeks lived under the constant threat of disease. A simple infection could turn fatal. A fever could sweep through a village and leave half its people gone within days. There were no hospitals as we know them, no antibiotics, and no real understanding of germs. Healing was as much a matter of faith as it was of knowledge. The Greeks believed that health was the harmony of the body and the elements. According to the teachings of Hippocrates, the father of medicine, every human was made of 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness, they thought, came when these humors fell out of balance. Too much black bile might cause sadness or melancholy. Too much yellow bile brought fever and anger. The goal of a physician was not to cure in the modern sense, but to restore balance through diet, rest, and occasionally purging. They bled the sick, applied leeches, or prescribed vomiting to drive out what they believed caused harm. The most educated doctors were few and far between. Most people relied on local healers, midwives, and herbalists who learned through generations of experience. They used herbs like garlic, honey, and willow bark to treat pain and wounds. Honey was spread over cuts to prevent infection. It worked better than they could have known. Vinegar was used to clean sores, and wine was poured over injuries to wash away dirt. These were small miracles in a time when the causes of illness were still mysteries whispered to the gods. When someone fell gravely ill, prayers often accompanied the treatments. The Greeks believed in divine influence over the body. Temples dedicated to Asclepius, the god of healing, served as sanctuaries where the sick would sleep and dream, hoping for a vision from the god that would reveal their cure. These places, called Asclepia, were scattered throughout Greece. Pilgrims would bring offerings, bathe in sacred waters, and lie down to rest in the cool stone halls. In the morning, priests interpreted their dreams and offered rituals or remedies. Sometimes the sick left healed, other times they simply left with hope. But not all ailments were gentle. Plague struck Greece more than once, bringing terror that no amount of prayer could ease. The most devastating was the plague of Athens during the Peloponnesian War, when the crowded city, walled in for safety, became a place of death. It began with fever, then vomiting, then open sores. People died within days, and the dead piled up faster than they could be buried. Fear consumed the city. Even the physicians fell ill, powerless to stop it. Thucydides, the historian, wrote of the plague with haunting detail, describing how law and decency broke down as people realized that death came for rich and poor alike. Everyday life carried its own quieter dangers. A simple wound from farm work could fester and become deadly. Childbirth claimed many women. Infants died from fevers or infections before their names were even recorded. Eye diseases, fevers, and stomach illnesses were constant companions. The Greeks turned to amulets and charms to protect themselves, hanging small tokens in their homes to ward off evil spirits or the jealousy of the gods. Illness was as much a spiritual battle as a physical one. And yet, amid all this fragility, the Greeks made remarkable strides in understanding the human body. They performed surgeries with bronze tools, stitched wounds with linen thread, and learned to set broken bones. Hippocrates and his followers observed patients closely, recording symptoms and outcomes, laying the foundations for modern medical observation. They believed in the power of nature to heal, and their advice to eat well, rest, and let the body find balance still echoes through medicine today. Still, if you were to live among them, sickness would terrify you. The faintest fever could mean death. A toothache might lead to infection. A small cut could end your life within days. There were no painkillers beyond wine or herbs, and no comfort beyond the prayers whispered at your bedside. Nights were long, filled with coughing, fever, and the desperate hope for dawn. Death was a familiar visitor, and each recovery felt like a gift from the gods. To survive in ancient Greece, you had to accept that life was fragile. Health was a temporary blessing, never guaranteed. The people lived close to nature, trusting it to harm and heal in equal measure. You wouldn't last long in that world of uncertainty, where every cough carried fear, and every cure was half a miracle. But somehow they did. They lived, they learned, and they built the foundations of healing that would one day save countless lives long after their own had ended. To live in ancient Greece was to live in the shadow of war. It was not an exception or an interruption in life. It was a constant presence. Every generation knew conflict. Every man expected to fight. War was not just a duty. It was a defining part of existence. The same civilization that gave the world philosophy, art, and democracy was also a world forged by battle. In city-states separated by mountains and pride, peace was fragile, and courage was a necessity. From childhood, Greek men were taught that war was a measure of honor. The heroes of myth, Achilles, Odysseus, and Hector, were not just characters in stories. They were models of manhood, examples of what it meant to live and die with glory. Boys grew up hearing tales of bravery and sacrifice, learning that their worth would one day be tested not in comfort, but in combat. Even the most peaceful farmer knew that his plow could become a spear when the call came. The city-states, or Peleus, were constantly at odds. Athens fought Sparta. Corinth fought Thebes. Small border disputes could turn into lifelong feuds. To defend one's city was sacred. In Athens, every citizen was expected to serve as a hoplite, a heavily armed infantryman, when war broke out. They trained with shields, spears, and helmets made of bronze, their armor weighing nearly 70 pounds. The hoplite phalanx, a wall of men moving as one, was the pride of Greek warfare. Each man's shield protected not just himself, but the soldier beside him. To break formation was to betray your comrades. To stand firm was to prove your worth. But the reality of war was not heroic. The noise, the heat, and the terror of battle were overwhelming. Imagine standing shoulder to shoulder in a sea of men, the sound of metal striking metal echoing in your ears. The ground is slick with dust and blood. The sun glares down through a haze of smoke. You can barely breathe beneath your helmet. The air stinks of sweat, iron, and death. When the lines clash, there is no art to it, only chaos. Spears shatter, swords flash, and men fall. A single mistake, one slip of the foot, and you are trampled or pierced through the chest. Victory means surviving long enough to see the enemy flee. And yet, when the battle ended, the suffering continued. Wounds festered, limbs were lost, and infection claimed more lives than blades. There were no hospitals, no anesthetics, only the rough care of comrades. A severed limb might be cauterized with a hot blade or wrapped in linen soaked with wine. Pain was constant and recovery uncertain. Those who survived carried scars both visible and invisible. The poets sang of glory, but the veterans carried silence. War was also deeply tied to religion. Before battles, generals sacrificed animals to the gods, reading omens in the smoke and the entrails. If the signs were favorable, they marched. If not, they waited. The soldiers prayed to Ares, god of war, and Athena, goddess of wisdom and strategy. They believed victory depended not only on skill, but on divine favor. To die bravely was to please the gods. To flee was to invite shame that followed a man even after death. For the families left behind, war was its own kind of torment. Wives watched their husbands march away, not knowing if they would ever return. Mothers prayed at the household altar for their sons' safety. When the dead came home, they came as ashes in urns, carried in solemn procession through the streets. Every victory had a cost that the women and children paid in grief and hunger. And yet the cycle continued, war after war, generation after generation. In Sparta, the relationship with war was even more absolute. Every man was a soldier from the moment he could stand. Every woman raised her sons to fight, saying, "Come back with your shield or on it." Cowardice was unthinkable. A Spartan's worth existed only in battle. They lived for it, trained for it, and died for it. For them, peace was not natural. It was simply the time between wars. In the end, the Greeks glorified war because they believed it revealed character. To fight was to prove courage. To die bravely was to achieve immortality in memory. Yet behind the poetry and the pride lay exhaustion and loss. The Peloponnesian War, fought between Athens and Sparta, dragged on for nearly 30 years, leaving cities burned, farms ruined, and countless lives destroyed. The philosophers who came after spoke of peace, but few had ever known it. If you were to live in ancient Greece, war would find you sooner or later. You would be called to march, to stand in the heat, to face the fear that comes when the spear lines close. You would learn the weight of armor and the sound of a dying man's breath. And when you returned, if you returned, you would never be the same. Because in that world, war was not an interruption of life. It was life itself. And to survive it, you would need more than courage. You would need the endurance of those who had no choice but to fight. In ancient Greece, law was the backbone of civilization, but justice was not always merciful. The Greeks prided themselves on order, on the rule of reason and fairness, yet their punishments could be as severe as the crimes they judged. For all their discussions of virtue and democracy, the world beneath those ideals was one where the law was feared as much as it was respected. To live under it was to walk a fine line, where a single mistake could mean ruin, exile, or death. Each city-state had its own laws and systems of justice. In Athens, where democracy was born, the people themselves were the court. Citizens gathered to judge disputes, to decide guilt and innocence. There were no professional judges or lawyers as we know them today. Ordinary men, farmers, merchants, and craftsmen became jurors, sometimes hundreds at a time, listening to arguments in open air. The accused had to speak for themselves, delivering their own defense. To stand before such a crowd, your fate hanging on their mood, was a test of both courage and eloquence. A weak voice or nervous tremor could doom you more swiftly than guilt itself. For small offenses, punishments could be fines or public humiliation. Debt, for example, could strip a man of his freedom. Those who could not repay might lose their land or even be enslaved to cover what they owed. Theft and fraud brought beatings or the confiscation of property. But for serious crimes, murder, treason, sacrilege, the penalties were grim. Execution was rare but final, carried out by drinking poison or by public stoning. Exile, though less bloody, was its own kind of death. To be cast out from one's city meant losing not only home and family, but identity. In a world where belonging defined existence, exile was unbearable loneliness. In Sparta, justice was harsher still. The Spartans valued obedience and discipline above all. Crime was not just a personal failing, it was an insult to the state. Punishments came swiftly and without sympathy. Thieves were whipped, deserters were branded as cowards, and even children were beaten for disobedience. The goal was not just correction, but control. Pain was a tool to remind everyone of their place, and fear was a constant companion. The weak were scorned, and mercy was seen as weakness itself. The treatment of slaves and women under the law revealed the deep inequalities of the Greek world. Slaves had no legal rights. They could be beaten, sold, or killed by their masters with little consequence. Women, even free citizens, were rarely allowed to testify in court and could not represent themselves. Their protection depended on male relatives' fathers, husbands, or sons. Justice for them was something that existed outside their reach. If a woman was wronged, her pain became a man's case to argue, her story filtered through his voice. Religious crimes were taken with particular seriousness. To disrespect the gods or to profane sacred spaces was not just a social offense, it was a threat to the entire city. The Greeks believed that angering the gods could bring plague, famine, or defeat in war. So they punished impiety with deadly certainty. The most famous case was that of Socrates, condemned in Athens for corrupting the youth and questioning the gods. His punishment, death, by drinking hemlock, was carried out calmly and publicly, a warning that even the wisest were not above the law. Public shaming was another powerful weapon. A criminal's name could be inscribed on tablets, displayed for all to see. The guilty might be paraded through the streets or made to perform humiliating tasks. In a society where reputation was everything, Shame could destroy a person as completely as imprisonment. To lose honor was to lose life in all but body. Many preferred exile to disgrace, choosing to wander foreign lands rather than endure the scorn of their fellow citizens. Even when justice seemed fair, it was still brutal by modern standards. There were no prisons for rehabilitation, only cells for holding the condemned. Torture was sometimes used to extract confessions, especially from slaves. The Greeks justified it as a way to reveal truth, believing pain could strip away lies. It was logic turned cruel, reason weaponized. And yet, for all its harshness, their system shaped much of what we now call justice, the idea that the law stands above all, that citizens must answer to it, and that fairness should be sought even in punishment. If you were to live under those laws, you would tread carefully, always aware of how fragile your safety was. A careless word, a public insult, or a debt unpaid could unravel your life. There were no second chances, no appeals, no leniency for ignorance. To survive, you would need not just obedience, but caution and restraint. You would learn to weigh every action, to measure every word, and to respect the invisible power that governed your world. The Greeks believed their laws brought order and justice, but they also brought fear. They taught their people discipline, but at a heavy cost. You might not last long in that world of rigid rules and unforgiving courts. Yet, for all its cruelty, that system of law laid the foundations of civilization, a fragile balance between fairness and punishment, between freedom and control. It was a reminder that the pursuit of justice has always carried a shadow, and in ancient Greece, that shadow was long and dark. To live in ancient Greece was to live surrounded by the gods. Every sound, every storm, every flicker of fortune was thought to carry their will. The Greeks did not simply believe in their gods. They felt them in the earth beneath their feet, in the wind across the sea, in the glow of the fire on their hearths. Religion was not a part of life. It was life itself. Every moment, from birth to death, was bound by ritual, prayer, and superstition. To defy it, even in thought, was to invite disaster. And for a modern person, raised in a world of reason and science, this constant reverence and fear would feel suffocating. The Greek gods were not distant deities. They were powerful, temperamental beings who behaved with all the passions and flaws of humanity. Zeus ruled from Olympus with thunder in his hand, yet was known for his jealousy and desires. Poseidon stirred the seas in anger when sailors offended him. Hera, Athena, Artemis all had tempers and pride. To the Greeks, the world was full of divine moods, and every natural event could be a message from above. A failed harvest might mean Demeter's displeasure. A sudden illness could be the punishment of Apollo. Nothing was truly random. Religion was woven into every aspect of life. In the home, each family kept a small shrine near the hearth, dedicated to Hestia, goddess of the flame. The fire had to be kept alive, for it symbolized both warmth and divine protection. Before every meal, a few crumbs or drops of wine were offered to the gods. Before journeys, sacrifices were made for safe passage. Before harvests, prayers rose for rain. It was not enough to be good or honest. One had to be respectful, cautious, and constantly aware of divine presence. Forgetting to offer thanks or neglecting a small ritual could bring misfortune, or so people believed. Temples dominated the landscape, gleaming on hilltops and by the sea. Each city had its patron god or goddess: Athens for Athena, Delphi for Apollo, Olympia for Zeus. Pilgrims traveled for days to offer sacrifices, bringing animals, grain, and incense. The scent of burning flesh and herbs filled the air as priests read omens in the smoke. The sound of chanting echoed through marble courtyards. Religion was not private, it was a spectacle, a shared act of devotion that united the people in faith and fear alike. Superstition colored even the smallest parts of daily life. People avoided certain words at night, feared the evil eye, and carried charms to protect against curses. Sneezing, tripping, or seeing an owl at the wrong time could be considered a sign from the gods. Dreams were seen as messages, and prophets interpreted them for a price. At crossroads, where spirits were believed to linger, travelers left offerings of food to appease wandering souls. Life was full of invisible rules, and every step risked offending something unseen. Even the wisest philosopher might hesitate before walking under an ill-omened star. The Greeks did not separate religion from science or medicine. The gods were part of every explanation. A doctor might recommend herbs and rest, but still advise the patient to pray to Asclepius. Farmers who studied the weather also sacrificed to Zeus for rain. Reason and belief existed side by side, one never replacing the other. Even in Athens, where thinkers questioned everything, piety was expected. When Socrates was condemned for corrupting the youth and questioning the gods, it showed how dangerous free thought could be in a world built on devotion. Religious festivals were both joy and obligation. During the Panathenaea in Athens, the city celebrated Athena with parades, sacrifices, and athletic contests. In Delphi, people gathered to hear the oracle's cryptic words, seeking answers to their most desperate questions. The oracle's voice, believed to come from Apollo himself, could shape the fate of nations. And yet, the process was often mysterious. A priestess inhaled sacred vapors rising from a fissure in the earth, entering a trance before delivering her riddles. Her words, filtered through priests, were interpreted as divine truth. The Greeks trusted her completely, for to doubt Apollo's messenger was unthinkable. For all its grandeur, Greek religion also carried darkness. Sacrifices, though often symbolic, could be bloody. Animals were slaughtered in offering, their blood poured on altars as priests recited prayers. In older times, some myths spoke of human sacrifice, a grim echo of fear that lingered from even earlier ages. Death itself was surrounded by strict rituals coins placed over the eyes to pay Charon, the ferryman of the dead, and offerings left at graves to keep spirits calm. To die without burial was a terrible fate, for it meant wandering forever in the shadows. If you lived in ancient Greece, you would not escape this web of faith. Every action, from stepping out the door to speaking a word, carried meaning. You would wake with prayers and sleep with fear of bad omens. You might consult oracles before traveling, offer sacrifices before making decisions, and whisper apologies to unseen gods if misfortune struck. To be careless was to court disaster. Even if you tried to think rationally, the weight of superstition would press on you until belief felt like survival. And yet, there was beauty in it too. The Greeks found meaning in the sacred rhythms of life. Their gods reflected the best and worst of humanity, making the divine feel close, familiar, and real. They lived with wonder, reverence, and awe for the mysteries around them. For us, their faith may seem like fear, but for them, it was the heartbeat of the world, a way to understand both life and death in a universe they could never fully control. You wouldn't last a day in that world of constant offerings and unseen forces. But for the Greeks, belief was not a burden. It was a comfort. It was the thread that connected them to the cosmos, the eternal bridge between mortal and divine. In the ancient world, movement was not freedom, it was danger. To travel in ancient Greece was to take your life in your hands. The land was rugged, the sea unpredictable, and the roads little more than dusty trails carved through mountains and valleys. There were no maps to rely on, no signs to guide the way, and no guarantee that you would reach your destination at all. For the Greeks, travel was a necessary hardship, undertaken only when trade, pilgrimage, or war demanded it. To us, used to the ease of roads and navigation, a single journey across their world would have felt endless and perilous. The Greek landscape itself was both beautiful and cruel. Mountains cut through the land like jagged bones, separating city-states and isolating communities. What looks like a scenic horizon to modern eyes was, for them, an obstacle course of stone and heat. Most people lived and died without traveling far from where they were born. To move between towns often meant climbing narrow passes, crossing dry riverbeds, or walking for days through wilderness. There were no inns or rest stops. Travelers slept in the open, on the ground, wrapped in cloaks against the chill of night. Food had to be carried or foraged. A journey of 20 miles could take an entire day. Bandits haunted the roads, preying on merchants and lone wanderers. Armed escorts were rare, and even a small group could fall victim to ambushes in the narrow passes. The Greeks told stories of heroes facing monsters, but the real monsters were human desperate thieves who lived off the wealth of others. Travelers carried knives, not for hunting, but for protection. Even wealthy merchants, who could afford pack animals and servants, risked everything each time they set out. The thought of losing one's cargo or life was common enough that many began their journeys with prayers and offerings to Hermes, the god of travelers and thieves alike. Sea travel, though faster, was no less dangerous. The Aegean and Mediterranean seas were lifelines of trade, but also graves for many. Greek ships were small, with single square sails and oars for power. They hugged the coastline whenever possible, avoiding the deep sea where storms rose without warning. A sudden squall could overturn a ship in moments, scattering men and cargo alike into the churning waves. There were no life vests, no rescue ships. To fall overboard was to vanish beneath the surface, another offering to Poseidon's temper. Sailors watched the sky for signs, clouds, wind shifts, the flight of seabirds trying to read the will of the sea gods. Despite the risks, trade was the lifeblood of Greek civilization. The land provided little beyond olives, grapes, and grain, so they looked to the sea for survival. Ships carried olive oil, wine, and pottery across the Aegean, returning with timber, metals, and spices. Ports like Piraeus near Athens bustled with activity, sailors shouting, ropes creaking, amphorae clinking as they were loaded and unloaded. The air smelled of salt, smoke, and tar. Deals were struck in the chaos, fortunes made and lost with each voyage. Trade connected the scattered city-states, spreading ideas as much as goods. Through these exchanges, Greek art, language, and thought reached distant shores. But for the ordinary person, travel was not about adventure. It was about endurance. A farmer might walk to the nearest market once or twice a year, leading a donkey laden with goods. A pilgrim might spend weeks on the road to reach a distant temple, sleeping wherever he could find shelter. The journey itself became an act of faith, a test of will. Every step was uncertain, every mile a small victory. Even messages took days or weeks to reach their destinations. A letter from one city-state to another might never arrive at all, lost to theft or weather. Hospitality was one of the few protections a traveler could count on. The Greeks called it xenia, a sacred bond between host and guest. To offer food and shelter to a stranger was both kindness and duty, watched over by Zeus himself. Those who violated hospitality, harming their guests or refusing aid, risked divine punishment. This custom gave weary travelers a chance to rest, to share news and stories by firelight, and to feel safe, if only for a night. It was a fragile mercy in a dangerous world. Still, the toll of travel was immense. Roads turned to mud in the rain, the summer heat baked the stones, and wild animals lurked in the forests. The simplest journey left one dusty, sunburned, and sore. Shoes wore thin, clothes tore, and supplies ran out quickly. Every sound in the dark brought fear, the rustle of leaves, the cry of an owl, the distant howl of wolves. By dawn, a traveler's greatest wish was not comfort, but survival. If you were to journey across ancient Greece, you would soon realize how vast and unforgiving that land truly was. The beauty of the mountains would lose its charm as exhaustion set in. The scent of the sea would bring as much dread as wonder. You would long for a map, for a road, for safety that never came. And yet, somehow, the Greeks endured it. They crossed those mountains, sailed those treacherous waters, and built connections that shaped the world. They accepted danger as part of life, trusting in courage, luck, and the favor of the gods. You wouldn't last long in their world of endless roads and restless seas. But they did. And through their endurance, trade flourished, cities grew, and the stories of their journeys became the first threads of civilization's great tapestry. Beneath the shining temples, beneath the proud philosophers and the marble statues, lay the true weight of Greek civilization, the countless poor and enslaved who built and sustained it. Their names were rarely written, their voices almost never heard. Yet without them, the great cities of Athens, Sparta, and Corinth could not have stood for a single day. While a few citizens debated the nature of virtue or sipped watered wine in shaded courtyards, the majority toiled endlessly under the weight of sun, stone, and hunger. The poor in ancient Greece made up the majority of the population. They were farmers, laborers, fishermen, servants, and street vendors. Their lives were governed not by politics or philosophy, but by survival. A poor farmer might own a small patch of rocky land, just enough to grow barley and a few olive trees. Every harvest was a gamble. A single storm or drought could wipe away an entire year's effort. Without modern tools or irrigation, he depended on the mercy of the weather and the goodwill of the gods. Hunger was not a distant fear, it was a regular companion. In the cities, life for the poor was not much better. The narrow streets of Athens were filled with those who worked from dawn until nightfall just to afford bread and oil. Craftsmen earned meager pay for long hours at the potter's wheel or the forge. Vendors crowded the agora, shouting over one another to sell fish, figs, or cheap cloth. The poorest of all beggars, orphans, and the elderly sat by the temple steps, hoping for charity from those leaving offerings to the gods. For them, survival depended on the kindness of strangers and the luck of a good day. Homes for the poor were small and dark, made of mud brick or rough stone. A single room might hold an entire family. There were no windows, only a doorway that let in smoke and flies. Furniture was simple wooden stools, mats, and clay jars. The air smelled of oil, sweat, and the dust that never truly left. Even sleep offered little rest, as fleas and mosquitoes shared the night. And yet, for all this, the poor kept the cities alive. They carried water from wells, built walls, harvested crops, and fought in wars when called upon. Their labor was invisible, but it held the world together. For the enslaved, life was even harsher. Slavery in ancient Greece was not based on race, but on conquest, debt, and birth. Many were prisoners of war, taken from distant lands and sold in markets. Others were children of slaves, born into bondage with no hope of freedom. They could be bought, traded, or punished at will. Some worked in households, cleaning, cooking, and caring for children. Others labored in the fields of the mines, their backs bent until they broke. The silver mines of Laurion were infamous dark, suffocating tunnels where men and boys worked in silence, breathing dust that turned their lungs to ash. Few ever escaped those depths alive. Even those who lived as household slaves faced constant fear. A careless mistake could bring beating or worse. Their food was whatever remained after their masters had eaten. They slept on floors or beside the hearth, rising before dawn to begin again. Yet not all slaves lived the same lives. Some, trusted and skilled, managed businesses or worked as tutors, especially in educated homes. A rare few might earn enough to buy their freedom, though freedom itself offered little guarantee of safety. A freed slave was still marked by their past, forever on the edge of respectability. The poor and enslaved found small comforts where they could. Music, laughter, and storytelling were their escape. In the evenings, they gathered outside, sharing bread, wine, and tales of heroes who defied the gods. They found beauty in simple things, the smell of baking bread, the cool touch of a sea breeze after a day of labor, the sound of a lyre drifting through the night. For all their hardship, they carried within them a quiet resilience. Their endurance was the foundation upon which the glory of Greece was built. But for a modern person, their life would be almost unbearable. Imagine waking before sunrise, working until your hands blister, and eating a meal so small it barely fills your stomach. Imagine never having a moment truly to yourself, never knowing safety, and never daring to dream beyond survival. The poor and enslaved lived that reality every day. And yet, through that suffering, they created the conditions for art, philosophy, and democracy to exist. Their toil built the temples. Their sweat carved the marble. Their silence made room for the voices of the free. In the myths, heroes fought monsters and defied death. In reality, the poor and enslaved fought hunger, exhaustion, and despair. They were the unseen heroes of daily life, enduring without glory. You would not last long among them, not because of cruelty alone, but because of the endless weight of effort required simply to live. They rose each morning without hope of reward, and still they worked. That endurance, silent and forgotten, was the truest act of strength in all of Greece. To look upon the ruins of ancient temples today is to see only half the story. The other half lies buried in the dust, in the footprints of those who carried the stones, who baked the bread, who lived and died without their names remembered. The world celebrated the few, but it was built by the many. When people imagine the philosophers of ancient Greece, they often see them as serene figures, strolling through marble courtyards, lost in thought, speaking wisdom to attentive students beneath olive trees. The truth, however, was far less peaceful. The great thinkers Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Diogenes, and countless others lived in a world that rarely rewarded thought. Their daily lives were filled with poverty, ridicule, and discomfort. To live by philosophy was to live in tension with society itself. The pursuit of truth was not a path to comfort, but a test of endurance. Socrates, perhaps the most famous of them all, lived his life as a poor man. He owned almost nothing, wore the same rough cloak through winter and summer, and walked barefoot through the streets of Athens. He spent his days questioning anyone who would speak to him: merchants, soldiers, politicians, challenging their beliefs and exposing contradictions in their reasoning. Many admired him, but many more despised him. He earned no money for his teaching, and his home was simple, barely protected from the cold. Yet he believed that comfort dulled the soul. For him, the pursuit of virtue was worth more than gold or glory. His end, when it came, was as harsh as his life, condemned to death for corrupting the youth and defying the gods. He calmly drank the cup of poison hemlock, teaching philosophy until his final breath. Others faced their own struggles. Diogenes, the founder of cynicism, took poverty to its extreme. He rejected all possessions, choosing to live in a large clay jar on the streets of Athens. He mocked the wealthy and powerful, walking through the marketplace in daylight with a lantern, saying he was searching for an honest man. People laughed at him, threw scraps of food, and called him mad. But he remained unmoved, believing that freedom came from needing nothing. His life, stripped of comfort, was a living argument that happiness came not from what one had, but from what one could do without. Plato, a student of Socrates, came from a wealthier background, but even he faced challenges in spreading his ideas. He founded the academy, one of the first institutions of higher learning, yet it existed without luxury. His students studied in open-air spaces, surrounded by the hum of insects and the chatter of the city. Books were rare, written by hand on scrolls of papyrus. Knowledge was passed mostly through speech, through long discussions that stretched late into the night. To teach philosophy was to live in uncertainty, relying on patrons and friends for support. Yet through these humble gatherings, ideas were born that would shape the world for centuries. Aristotle, the great systematizer of thought, faced similar realities. He studied under Plato, then became a teacher himself, wandering the courtyards of the Lyceum with his students. His writings were immense, covering everything from logic and ethics to biology and politics. But he, too, lived with the fragility of his time. Paper was precious, ink expensive, and copies were made by hand. His school had no libraries, only minds. When politics turned against him, he fled Athens to avoid the fate of Socrates, saying he would not let the city sin twice against philosophy. Even the greatest minds had to bow to the instability of the world around them. Philosophers lived among noise and struggle. Athens was not a quiet sanctuary, but a bustling, crowded city, full of arguments, merchants, and street performers. The thinkers who changed history did so amid chaos, not peace. They debated in marketplaces, taught under open skies, and endured hunger more often than satisfaction. Their devotion to wisdom was not an escape from hardship, it was forged within it. Philosophy was survival through thought. To the ordinary people of Greece, philosophers were both fascinating and strange. Some saw them as teachers, others as nuisances who spoke too much and worked too little. They were known to wander aimlessly, muttering to themselves, dressed poorly, and living on little more than bread, olives, and water. The idea of living for knowledge, rather than wealth, was alien to most. Still, these men and a few women pushed questions that reached beyond survival. What is justice? What is happiness? What is the good life? They sought answers not from the gods, but from the human mind itself. Yet their lives were not free from contradiction. Many of them wrote about balance and moderation while living in discomfort. They spoke of virtue, but depended on the generosity of others. They were admired when times were peaceful and condemned when times grew hard. A philosopher's life was always precarious. Even the pursuit of truth could become dangerous if it threatened the pride or faith of those in power. If you were to live as a philosopher in ancient Greece, you would quickly feel the weight of that life. You would have little food, little rest, and less comfort. You would walk through dusty streets, debating with anyone who would listen, often mocked or ignored. Nights would be long, spent beneath flickering lamps, copying words by hand until the oil burned out. And yet, amid that struggle, you might find something deeper clarity, purpose, and the strange joy that comes from seeing the world with open eyes. The philosophers of Greece lived hard lives, but they left behind ideas that outlasted empires. They proved that wisdom can grow even in poverty, and that truth can shine brightest in hardship. They were not men of marble, they were men of dust and endurance. And though they suffered in their time, their words became immortal, whispering through the centuries to remind us that even in the hardest lives, thought can be freedom. Few names in ancient history carry as much weight as Sparta. To many, it represents discipline, bravery, and the unyielding spirit of the warrior. The image of the Spartan standing firm with shield and spear, fearless in the face of death, has become a legend. But the reality behind that legend was far less glorious. The true Sparta was a place of strict control, constant fear, and endless hardship. To live there was not to live freely, but to serve a system that demanded everything and gave little in return. From birth, every Spartan's life was decided by the state. When a child was born, elders examined it carefully. If the baby was strong and healthy, it was allowed to live. If it showed weakness, deformity, or frailty, it was abandoned to die on the slopes of Mount Taygetus. This was not cruelty in their eyes, it was policy. Sparta was built on the belief that only the strongest should survive, that the weak endangered the whole. Every life belonged not to the family, but to the city. Love was secondary to duty. For boys, childhood was brief. At 7 years old, they were taken from their homes and placed into the agoge, the state's brutal military training system. There, they learned endurance through pain and discipline through deprivation. They were beaten for mistakes, starved to teach cunning, and forced to steal food without getting caught. If they were discovered, punishment was severe not for the theft itself, but for failing to hide it. They slept on beds of reeds, trained barefoot in the cold, and learned to obey without hesitation. Their lives were stripped of softness, crafted to shape soldiers who would never question orders. By the time a Spartan boy reached adulthood, his body was hardened, but his spirit was shaped by years of fear and control. Loyalty to the state was absolute. Friendship, family, even love were secondary to Sparta's needs. Men lived in communal barracks, eating simple meals of black broth, a soup made from pig's blood, vinegar, and salt. They were not allowed to live with their wives until their 30s, and even then, family life was limited. A Spartan's true home was with his brothers in arms. Women in Sparta lived differently than in other Greek cities, but their freedom came with its own cost. They were raised to be strong, to exercise, and to speak boldly. They could own property and manage estates, especially when their husbands were away at war. Yet their independence was not for themselves. It existed to serve the state. Spartan women were expected to bear strong sons, to raise warriors without weakness. They were told that dying in childbirth was as honorable as a man dying in battle. Their lives, too, belonged to Sparta. Slavery was the dark engine that kept this society running. The Helots enslaved people from conquered lands. Especially Messenia worked the fields and provided food so that Spartan men could devote themselves entirely to war. They outnumbered their masters many times over, and for that reason, the Spartans lived in constant fear of rebellion. To control them, they ruled through terror. Every year, Spartan leaders declared war on the Helots, allowing young men to kill them without penalty as a form of training. This ritualized cruelty ensured obedience, but it also revealed the truth of Spartan strength. It was built on the suffering of others. Sparta's isolation was both its power and its curse. Unlike Athens, which celebrated art, philosophy, and democracy, Sparta rejected change. They banned the use of gold and silver, discouraged travel, and shunned foreign influence. Their world was simple, rigid, and controlled. For centuries, this system made them strong in war, but empty in spirit. They produced fearless soldiers, but little culture. While Athens built temples and wrote plays, Sparta trained and drilled. When peace came, they did not know how to live in it. The myth of Spartan glory reached its height during the Persian Wars, especially at Thermopylae, where King Leonidas and his 300 soldiers held their ground against overwhelming odds. Their courage was real, and their sacrifice unforgettable. But their story, immortalized in legend, hides the suffering that made it possible, the childhood stolen, the freedom denied, and the lives built on discipline instead of joy. Sparta's greatness was bought with pain, and though it dazzled the world, it could not last. In time, their rigid system broke under its own weight, leaving behind ruins and memories. If you were to live in Sparta, you would not survive long. The silence, the hunger, the unrelenting pressure to conform would crush you. There was no room for weakness, no space for doubt. Laughter was rare, luxury forbidden, and tenderness seen as weakness. Even sleep offered no escape, for every day was a test of endurance. The life of a Spartan was not about happiness, it was about obedience, duty, and survival. Yet, for all its harshness, Sparta left behind a legacy of discipline and strength that still fascinates the world. It shows how far a society can go in the name of power, and how easily humanity can be lost in the pursuit of perfection. The Spartan myth endures because it speaks to something deep within us, the desire to be strong, unyielding, fearless. But the truth reminds us that such strength often comes at a terrible cost. You would not last a day in Sparta, not because you were weak, but because their way of life left no space for what makes life worth living. There was a strange beauty to Greek warfare, though it was a beauty carved from terror, sweat, and blood. To the people of ancient Greece, war was both art and duty, a brutal necessity and a sacred calling. The sound of shields striking, the glint of bronze in the sunlight, and the slow, measured march of the phalanx were as much a part of life as the harvest or the festival. To fight was to prove one's honor. To fail was to face disgrace. Yet for those who stood in those battle lines, there was little glory, only exhaustion and fear wrapped in bronze. A Greek soldier or hoplite was not a professional warrior. He was a farmer, a craftsman, a citizen who took up arms when his city called. Each man provided his own armor: a heavy bronze helmet, a round shield called a hoplon, a breastplate, greaves, and a spear. The weight of it all could exceed 70 pounds. Marching under the heat of the sun, carrying that burden across hills and plains, would leave even the strongest gasping for breath before the battle began. Yet there was no choice. To serve was an honor, and refusal was unthinkable. The laws of the city demanded it, and the eyes of one's peers enforced it. When the armies met, they did so with ceremony and fear. The soldiers formed the phalanx, a wall of shields, each man's protection depending on the man beside him. Courage, then, was not about heroism alone. It was about trust. To break formation was to doom your comrades. The line moved forward slowly, spears bristling, shields locked, the sound of sandals scuffing in unison. Drums and pipes echoed through the air. And then, with a final cry, the two lines collided with a crash that shook the ground. The fight was chaos. Spears splintered. Men screamed. The air grew hot with dust and blood. The first moments of impact were confusion, no room to swing a sword, no space to breathe. The front lines crushed together, men heaving against the weight of their shields. The smell of metal, sweat, and fear filled the air. Underfoot, the earth grew slick. Victory went not to the bravest, but to the side that held their formation the longest. Those who fell were trampled. Those who ran were hunted down. The sun watched without pity, and when it set, the ground was covered with the silent bodies of those who had once stood shoulder to shoulder. Yet the Greeks saw war not just as bloodshed, but as a reflection of their values. To fight bravely was to uphold auric excellence of character. To die well was to achieve Clio's eternal glory. Even death had its own beauty, wrapped in the poetry of sacrifice. Bards would sing of the fallen, their names preserved in verse long after their bones had turned to dust. In this way, war became part of the mythology of life, a harsh stage upon which men proved their worth before gods and men alike. After the battle, the field was eerily quiet. Survivors moved among the dead, collecting the bodies of friends and family. The fallen were burned or buried with ceremony, their shields placed over their graves. Offerings were made to Ares and Athena, the gods of war and wisdom. Even in victory, the Greeks showed reverence for the defeated. A truce was often declared to allow both sides to honor their dead. But beneath that ritual lay grief, a deep, silent sorrow that no song could ease. The spoils of war were as grim as the fight itself. Cities were plundered, temples stripped, and survivors enslaved. Women and children were taken as captives, and the victors carried home not just gold and goods, but memories that haunted their sleep. For every tale of glory, there were 100 of despair. And yet, for centuries, the Greeks continued to fight city against city, brother against brother, believing that war revealed truth and forged strength. The tools of battle, though simple, were masterpieces of craftsmanship. The curved edge of a sword, the shine of a polished shield, the intricate designs carved into armor, all spoke of pride and artistry. Even destruction had elegance in their eyes. Warriors carried symbols of their gods into battle, Believing divine favor rested in the gleam of bronze and the firmness of resolve. There was no separation between the sacred and the violent. Every battle was an offering to the gods, every victory a sign of divine approval. For someone from the modern world, the horror of it would be overwhelming. The weight of the armor alone would drain you before the first blow. The noise, the heat, the closeness of death, all of it would shatter your resolve within moments. You would long to run, but there would be nowhere to go. To turn your back meant dishonor worse than death. To stand your ground meant becoming part of the living wall, where survival depended not on speed or strength, but on sheer endurance. And yet, the Greeks found meaning in this brutality. War was their teacher. It reminded them of mortality, of courage, of the thin line between civilization and chaos. They built beauty from the ashes of destruction songs, poems, temples, and tales that still echo today. They saw in the clash of spears the reflection of life itself, brief, violent, and fleetingly glorious. You would not last a day in that world of bronze and dust, where men marched willingly toward death in the name of honor. But the Greeks did, and through their blood and bravery, they left behind a vision of strength that still stirs the imagination, a reminder that even in the harshest struggle, there can be a strange, haunting kind of beauty. In ancient Greece, life was as fragile as the flame on a lamp's wick bright for a moment, flickering in the breeze, and easily extinguished. Every day was a quiet negotiation with death. The people who lived in that world did not take life for granted, because they could not. Disease, famine, war, and accident waited at every turn. The average lifespan was short, and even the strongest could be undone by a single fever or wound. To survive to old age was not a certainty, it was a miracle. Childbirth was one of the most dangerous moments in life. Women faced it with courage and prayer, knowing that many would not rise again. Without the help of doctors or antiseptics, birth depended entirely on the skill of midwives and the mercy of the gods. Mothers often made offerings to Eileithyia, goddess of childbirth, or to Artemis, asking for protection. If both mother and child survived, thanks were given immediately. But if they did not, mourning was swift and quiet. Death, even in the home, was something the Greeks learned to meet with composure. For infants, survival was a matter of chance. Many died within the first few years of life, victims of fever, infection, or hunger. Families loved deeply but cautiously, knowing that attachment could bring pain. A child's laughter in the courtyard was a fragile joy, never taken for granted. When a child died, small graves were dug near the home, and offerings of toys or tiny vases were left behind. Life was short, but remembrance was sacred. Beyond childhood, dangers multiplied. A cut from farm work could fester and turn deadly. A cold could become pneumonia. A broken bone could cripple for life. People carried scars, limps, and ailments that we would now treat easily. The air was filled with dust, the water often foul. Diets were limited, and hunger was a shadow that never truly disappeared. A bad harvest could bring famine that wiped out entire villages. Those who survived learned to eat little, sleep lightly, and never waste. War claimed many more lives than peace ever did. Young men went off to battle with songs and cheers, but few returned. Those who did often came home broken in body and mind. The sound of mourning was familiar in every city. Mothers cut their hair in grief. Fathers stood in silence beside urns of ashes. Death in war was considered honorable, yet loss was still loss. The monuments we admire today were often built in memory of those who never returned. Accidents were common too. Roads were rough, tools crude, and ships unpredictable. A storm at sea, a fall from a roof, a collapsing wall, any of these could end a life in seconds. The Greeks understood that control was an illusion. They accepted fate, or Moira, as an unchangeable force. Even the gods could not escape it. Life, they believed, was a thread spun by the fates Clotho spinning, Lachesis measuring, Atropos cutting when the time came. The thread's length was unknown, its end certain. The old were rare, but revered. To reach old age meant you had lived wisely or luckily, perhaps both. The elderly were honored for their endurance and experience, though they too lived with hardship. There were no medicines to ease their pain, no comforts beyond family and faith. Their bodies ached, their eyes dimmed, but they carried the memory of generations. They told stories by the fire, passing down wisdom to those who might not live as long. In a world where tomorrow was never promised, memory became the truest form of immortality. Religion helped soften the fear of death. The Greeks believed the soul continued on after the body failed. They imagined the underworld, a shadowy realm ruled by Hades, where all souls went, noble and common alike. It was not a place of torment, but of quiet, eternal twilight. The dead drank from the river Lethe to forget their earthly lives. Heroes, however, might reach the Elysian fields, a peaceful afterlife reserved for the virtuous. These beliefs gave comfort, but also shaped how the living viewed their time on earth. To live well, to act honorably, and to be remembered, that was the closest thing to eternity. Funerals were acts of both love and duty. The dead were washed, anointed with oil, and wrapped in linen. Coins were placed over their eyes or in their mouths, payment for Charon, the ferryman who carried souls across the river Styx. Mourners sang laments, tearing their clothes and cutting their hair in grief. After burial or cremation, offerings of wine and food were made at the grave. Even years later, families returned to pour libations and whisper prayers, ensuring that the dead were not forgotten. To neglect the dead was an offense to both gods and memory. If you were to live in ancient Greece, you would feel life's fragility in every breath. You would wake each morning knowing that sickness, accident, or misfortune could end everything before the next sunrise. Yet in that awareness, there was also meaning. Each sunrise, each shared meal, each small joy carried weight. The people of Greece lived close to the edge, but that nearness to death made them cherish the beauty of living. The sea's shimmer, the sound of laughter, the warmth of bread, all were treasures precisely because they could vanish in an instant. You would not last a day under the constant uncertainty they accepted as normal. But they endured, and through their endurance, they found wisdom. They learned to live fully in the moment, to respect fate, and to honor both life and death. Their world was fragile, but in its fragility lay a truth we often forget, that every heartbeat, no matter how brief, carries the weight of eternity. Every civilization believes it will last forever, but in ancient Greece, decline came slowly, so slowly that those living through it might not have noticed at first. The cities still stood, the temples still gleamed, and the philosophers still spoke. But beneath the surface, the pulse of Greece weakened. The wars that once brought glory now left only ruin. The soil, overworked and dry, gave less each year. The people, worn down by conflict and hardship, began to lose faith in the ideals that had once made their world shine. The fall of Greece was not one great collapse, but a long unraveling, a quiet descent into exhaustion. The Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta was the beginning of that end. For nearly 3 decades, the greatest city-states of Greece fought one another, burning crops, besieging towns, and wasting countless lives. Athens, once radiant with art and democracy, became a city of hunger and disease. Sparta, triumphant in war, found that victory brought no peace. When the fighting finally ended, both were shadows of their former selves. Fields lay barren, homes abandoned, and a generation of men was gone. The old ideals of honor and courage had been buried with them. The poor suffered most in this slow collapse. With trade disrupted and farmlands ruined, hunger spread. Families sold what little they had to survive: tools, land, even children. The cities filled with beggars and refugees, people displaced by endless wars. Disease returned with the crowded streets, carried by dirty water and rats. The once proud marketplaces of Athens and Corinth grew quieter, their stalls half empty, their voices weary. Hope became a scarce commodity. Even religion began to change. The old gods, who had once seemed so near, began to feel distant. People still offered sacrifices, still prayed, but the connection felt thinner. Some turned to new philosophies for comfort. Stoicism taught them to endure without complaint, to accept pain and loss as part of the natural order. Epicureanism, on the other hand, urged them to seek simple pleasures, to find peace in friendship, good food, and quiet living. These ideas were born from a people who had seen too much chaos, who no longer believed that glory came from war or fame, but from survival and balance. The countryside, once alive with small farms and villages, emptied slowly. Many young men left for distant lands, serving as mercenaries in foreign armies. Others sought fortune in colonies or ports far away, hoping to escape the poverty that gripped their homeland. Greece's strength had always been its people, but now those people were scattered. The cities, still proud in their marble and memory, became hollow echoes of their former greatness. Art and culture endured, though even they bore the marks of decline. The sculptures became more emotional, the plays darker, the philosophy more focused on endurance than triumph. The grand optimism of earlier generations faded into melancholy reflection. The Greeks began to look backward, to their own golden age, already mythologizing it even as they stood among its ruins. They spoke of what once was, rather than what could be. For the ordinary person, life in this declining world was full of quiet desperation. Work remained hard, but now there was less purpose to it. The rewards were smaller, the risks higher. Hunger and fear became familiar companions. Many felt abandoned by the gods, left to struggle in a land that had once been blessed. The rich withdrew into their estates, while the poor crowded together for warmth and safety. The nights felt longer, the songs fewer. And still, life went on, as it always does even in decay, and came new conquerors. First Macedon under Philip and his son Alexander, who united Greece not through peace but through dominance. Under Alexander, the Greek world expanded beyond imagination east into Persia, Egypt, and India. For a moment, it seemed like rebirth. Greek language, art, and ideas spread across continents. But for those who remained at home, little changed. Their fields were still dry, their bellies still empty. The glory of empire belonged to kings and generals, not to the people who had built the foundations of that greatness with their hands and sweat. When Alexander died, his empire fractured, and the world he left behind was one of turmoil and confusion. Greece became a prize fought over by foreign powers, its independence fading. The Romans came next, admiring Greek art and wisdom, even as they absorbed the land into their own empire. The proud city-states became provinces. The gods of Olympus were blended with Roman deities, their temples turned to ruins or reused for new faiths. The age of Greece ended not with an explosion, but with a sigh. If you were to live through that slow fall, you would feel it not in grand events, but in small moments, the bread that grew more expensive, the market that grew emptier, the songs that grew quieter with each passing year. You would watch as hope thinned like old cloth, fraying at the edges. Yet you would also see how, even in decline, the Greeks endured. They adapted, thought, and dreamed. Their ideas outlived their suffering. Their words crossed oceans of time. You wouldn't last long in that fading world, where survival replaced ambition and glory turned to dust. But they did. They carried on with dignity, even as their civilization dimmed. And perhaps that is the most human thing of all to keep living, even as the light fades, holding on to memory, faith, and the stubborn will to continue. Greece fell, but it never truly vanished. Its spirit endured, whispered in stone and story. A reminder that even in the twilight of history, the fire of humanity never truly goes out. And so, as we leave the world of ancient Greece behind, the marble fades, the sea grows still, and the whispers of the past settle into silence. You have walked through the streets of Athens and Sparta, stood beneath the hot sun of the Aegean, and felt the weight of a life built on struggle, endurance, and faith. What began as a civilization of beauty and wisdom was also a world of hardship and fragility. The people who built it did so not in comfort, but in constant challenge. Every statue, every poem, every idea was born from a place of labor, hunger, and persistence. We often look at ancient Greece as the cradle of civilization, the birthplace of democracy, philosophy, and art. But beneath those achievements was a life that demanded everything from those who lived it. The farmers who worked the rocky soil, the mothers who gave birth in silence, the soldiers who marched into battle without knowing if they would return. All of them built the foundation on which history would stand. The beauty of Greece was never separate from its suffering. It was carved from it. If you had lived there, you would have felt every hour, every breath. You would have learned that survival was not a given, but an accomplishment. The heat, the hunger, the endless work, these were the rhythms of daily life. Yet, within those hardships, the Greeks found meaning. They built temples that still stand after millennia. They wrote words that still shape our thoughts. They dreamed of perfection, even as they lived in imperfection. Their world has vanished, but their spirit remains etched into the stones, carried in our language, remembered in our stories. So as you drift toward sleep, imagine the glow of lamplight flickering on worn stone walls. Imagine the hum of cicadas outside an ancient home, the scent of olive oil and dust, and the soft murmur of the Aegean in the distance. Somewhere, a philosopher speaks quietly to his students, a mother hums to her child, a soldier sharpens his spear by firelight. The world moves slowly, endlessly, beneath the same stars that watch over us now. Thank you for listening to this journey through ancient Greece. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to History for Sleep. Your support helps us keep these stories alive, turning history into calm, thoughtful nights. Let us know in the comments what parts of history you delight to dream, but next may be ancient Rome, the Middle Ages, or the world of the pharaohs. Tell us when you listen at bedtime, on quiet afternoons, or whenever you need to drift away into another time. Until next time, rest easy. Let the voices of the past guide you into gentle dreams. The people of ancient Greece have told their stories. Now it's time to close your eyes, breathe slowly, and let history carry you to sleep.